the 6th of June 1944. One of the most infamous dates of modern history, it marks the day when the Allied armies of Britain, Canada and the United States set out across the English Channel in one of history's most audacious invasion missions, in a bid to free Europe from the grip of Nazi tyranny. The landing of Allied troops on the beaches of Normandy remains a haunting example to the full horror of war. And it's almost without exception that if we think of D-Day, we picture the soldiers. More than any other image of this event, it is the army who have come to symbolise the victories fought for in France. Normandy remains a place of great reflection, and serves as a reminder to those who visit that the freedom we now enjoy has come at a high price. For 60 years after the last shots rang out in Normandy, we remain fascinated by the events that took place here. But despite all the published writings, the television documentaries and even Hollywood films, there is a part of the D-Day landings and the battle for Normandy, France, that remains overlooked, and with it a story untold. This is the story of a long-forgotten Air Force and the pivotal role it played in the battle to free France and eventually Europe. Based on the front lines, flying from airstrips carved into the Normandy fields, young pilots from as many as 14 different nationalities came together to fly an aircraft that is celebrated by the French in their National Memorial Museum in the city of Caen. These men were Typhoon pilots. This is the untold story of the rocket-firing Typhoons and the men brave enough to fly them into combat.
Over the years, it's been my good fortune to correspond with, often meet and talk over wartime experiences with a large number of Typhoon pilots. I wouldn't say they're a different breed apart, but they certainly are pretty impressive people. From the earliest days of Typhoon flying, when they had to fly across the Channel or across the North Sea in a single-engined aircraft with a known unreliable engine, to the Normandy campaign and the battle throughout northwest Europe, when they had to face the most efficient anti-aircraft fire in the world, and they had to face up to that knowing that their chances of survival were not too great. The casualty rates are very high indeed, and it's quite notable that when there was a shortage of Typhoon pilots, there weren't an awful lot of volunteers. So those who did fly Typhoons, I think, deserve special thought and special admiration.
Before the large media event of the official D-Day anniversary, a small group of veterans and their families gathered in May 2004 to remember in their own way fallen comrades and the part they themselves played in the liberation of France. For many, returning to Normandy stirs the memories of 60 years ago.
Our flight commander, Kenny Gear, came in wheels up because he was damaged, and he came in very hot, as we say. Instead of coming in at 120, he came in about 160. And you saw the roadway crossing the runway. Well, the scoop on the Tiffy, when cruising along the ground, it caught the roadway. The aircraft flipped over, and all that was left of it was the cockpit that Kenny was sitting in. And about 5'4", he survived because he was so short. So that's a memory that I have of this place.
Camped outdoors with their aircraft, and without sufficient protection, pilots and ground crew had to endure enemy shell fire almost daily.
When we arrived, we knew the artillery was quite close, and so I dug this trench to put my camp bed in it, which I did duly in it. These two laughed their heads off while I was doing it, and the next morning, just at daylight, the shells started falling, and of course I was down there, all right, and then they both came diving in on top of me, and of course I realised I was safe then. I had two bodies to
And all he said was, "Hello, Jeff."
Something like that.
Having played a major part in the majority of operations across the European theatre of war, from 1942 to the capitulation in 1945, it remains an enigma as to why a weapon as potent as the Typhoon has received so little attention in the histories of this conflict.
Almost all the German commanders who were interviewed at the end of the war about the Normandy invasion and the battle through France were unanimous in their view that air power on the Allied side had been absolutely decisive, and they all said without air power the German army might well have been a match for the American and British armies, which I think is probably true. With air power, the American and the British forces were able to tear the German resistance to pieces. The heavily armed fighter bomber was a very important innovation, and it did have very real effects, both in the build-up to D-Day and on the actual day itself, and certainly in the campaign through Normandy and France. What the British and Americans were able to achieve at last was real accuracy on the battlefield, which the heavy bombers and medium bombers couldn't really achieve.
Whilst many flying examples of aircraft from the Second World War still remain to this day, you won't find a Hawker Typhoon among them. In a matter of months at war's end, the Typhoon all but disappeared without a trace. Destroyed and sold as scrap, there now remains only one original intact example of this extraordinary aircraft. The last Typhoon. A silent reminder of a devastating weapon and the first true fighter bomber. Conceived as early as 1937 by Sir Sidney Cam, chief designer of Hawker aircraft, the Typhoon was one of two designs produced in response to Air Ministry demands for a new frontline fighter. However, during an early test flight of the first Typhoon, structural failure just behind the cockpit almost broke the aircraft in two. Hawker's chief test pilot, Philip Lucas, was awarded the George Medal for his skill and courage in bringing the aircraft back to Earth in one piece. But the Typhoon's tail problems were not solved before it had entered service. Despite near catastrophe, the Typhoon won the race between the two designs, mainly due to its unorthodox but immensely powerful Napier Sabre engine. This 1-ton, 24-cylinder monster remains the most powerful aero engine of its kind ever to be mass-produced.
The size of the engine, it being very compact, hides the fact that it produces in the region of 2,500 horsepower.
Twice as powerful as current engines such as the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the Sabre was groundbreaking for its time.
The engines, for there are in fact two joined together, lay one above the other and are horizontally opposed with 6 inline cylinders each side.
But the heart of the Typhoon would also prove to be its Achilles heel early on. In 1941, the very first Typhoons had been delivered with all their gremlins to their first operational squadron. Previously on Hurricanes, 56 Squadron now had to get to grips with the Typhoon and its many idiosyncrasies, which included just getting it started. Bill Cotty was one of the first people to work with the new Sabre engine at Hawker's headquarters in Langley.
When you got in, First of all, you pumped up the carburettor primer. You then got hold of the cylinder primer and so many pumps with the cylinder primer depending on the temperature of the day.
The engine was started by firing an explosive charge similar to a shotgun cartridge.
When you fired the cartridge, you press two buttons, the booster coil and the cartridge.
On firing one of the 5 cartridges in the magazine, the gas produced passed to a piston and Bendix drive in order to give the engine a quick twist of in the region of 1.5 revolutions of that top crankshaft.
Pilots that had been used to the simple push-button electric starters on Hurricanes and Spitfires would often overprime the Sabre engine if it didn't start for the first time.
And then you really got into trouble, and you could go on pumping fuel in and fuel running out underneath until there's a colossal backfire and there was flames in the air intake. And then the chappie would run up with a fire extinguisher and put the fire extinguisher down the air intake, which didn't help.
Fires on startup were not uncommon. For some pilots, starting the Typhoon was to prove just as hazardous as flying it into combat.
I saw these airmen arrive with about a dozen fire extinguishers. I said, what are they for? They said, oh, this one always catches fire. I said, no, rubbish, you see. So I made a mental note of that and didn't prime it as much as I would have done my particular aeroplane. Anyway, sure enough, when I pressed the start button, there were flames everywhere, you see, coming round in a spiral around the cockpit with the ground crew shouting fire and signalling cut engine, and I'm saying, no, leave me alone, and open up the throttle, because then you blow all the flames out, and it was all right, but they'd got fire extinguishers like they were going out of fashion.
19-year-old Roy Crane was one of many young pilots who looked forward to the chance of flying the new fighter, but his first encounter with the aircraft was not what he could have foreseen.
When we got to Millfield, we expected to see Typhoons, and we arrived in a coach, and we certainly did, because somebody shouted, look up there, and we looked up into the sky, and there was a Typhoon spinning, and it continued spinning down until it hit the airfield and blew up, and the pilot was killed.
The crash had been caused by the tail breaking off in mid-air. But another problem was now emerging to add to the list: carbon monoxide poisoning. Fumes leaking from the engine into the cockpit had, at least on one occasion, asphyxiated the pilot, causing him to crash. The only practical solution to the problem in the end was for Typhoon pilots to be on oxygen from the moment they started their engines to the moment they shut them down. But the Typhoon still had its admirers.
Well, I thought actually it sounded good because it had what I was looking for in an aeroplane. By then I hadn't become an expert, but I'd flown the things here and there once or twice, and the old Hurricane used to more or less go along sedately like an elderly person, although it did chuck itself around if you pushed it, and I could push them. But when we got to a Typhoon, it was a bit of a brute, but it had 2,500 horsepower under the bonnet in my left hand, and I really felt that.
And it was like being hit in the back with a sledgehammer when you open the throttle. Having been warned that it would swing violently to the right, I managed to get it off the ground. But I think it was something like 1,500 feet before I worked out I ought to take the undercarriage out.
Douglas Coxhead gave Roy Crane his first introduction at 182 Squadron.
He was told to take me out and show me the controls. So I put the parachute on, plus the dinghy, and got into the cockpit. And Dougie looked over and said, well, look, Roy, you've read the book, you know where everything is. Good luck, and pushed the door to, because at that time the Typhoon had doors.
The car door design was unpopular with all Typhoon pilots, as its cumbersome design made bailing out in an emergency all the more difficult.
I found it very claustrophobic, And when we switched over to having bodies with the teardrop canopy, oh, that was marvellous. It's like sitting outside it and all-round vision.
As was the standard with most RAF fighter aircraft of the period, the early Typhoon, named the A1, was equipped with a Browning .303 machine gun, 4 to each wing. The decision to eventually fit Typhoons with cannons would later prove an important factor in the use of the Typhoon as a ground attack aircraft.
And a cannon could go through a wall and into an aeroplane out the other side. Machine guns just cause damage. Well, you hit something with a cannon, 9 times out of 10 it's going to blow up.
By 1942, a new problem was facing the RAF in the form of the latest Luftwaffe aircraft, the brilliant Focke-Wulf 190. Too fast for existing aircraft to catch, this fighter bomber would roam in under RAF radar and strike coastal targets at will before fleeing back across the channel. That is until Typhoon squadrons were assigned to the problem.
We could take off, having been scrambled, right over Beachy Head, hitting the seagulls, etc., as we took off, and catch these aircraft up halfway across the channel. And I had an incident with the Focke-Wulf 190, whom I got into a fight with right on the deck, and he tightened up and he turned so much so that he flicked high-speed stall and flicked the other way and went into the drink. I couldn't get inside him to fire a shot.
The growing Typhoon force was now spread out along the south coast of England, flying mostly defensive fighter patrols. It would be the endeavours of 23-year-old squadron leader Dennis Crowley-Milling to prove the aircraft in the ground attack role. Formed in late 1942, 181 was the first fighter bomber squadron, and one 19-year-old pilot in particular remembers his commanding officer's attitude to the task.
Dead keen. He'd had oodles of experience. I mean, he'd been to France, before Dunkirk.
The Typhoons before D-Day had a number of important tasks to perform. One of them, of course, was to assault the German radar chain, which was reasonably effective, not completely effective. Radar was very difficult equipment to knock out entirely, even with overwhelming air power. They were also directed, of course, at other vulnerable communications targets, precise military targets. They had a very important part to play, and of course could now attack these targets with the kind of accuracy that heavy bombers could never achieve.
Compared to the slow, high-flying bombers, the Typhoons could get in close to their targets, ensuring precision strikes with cannon or bombs. By 1943, more Typhoon squadrons were making the transition to ground attack operations, with the Typhoon's payload steadily increasing from carrying 2 250-pound bombs up to 2 1,000-pound bombs, the equivalent weight of carrying a modern family car under each wing.
What we used to do was fly at sea level across the channel, and then about a mile out from the French coast, climb up to 10,000 feet.
We used to fly just past the target, so the target was at 120 degrees to you, on the left or right. The CO would go down. On the target you count 3 and then number 2, so every 3 seconds an aircraft peeled over. That puts you into about a 60-degree dive.
The bombs were not fused until you were actually ready to drop them. As far as I remember, just you threw a switch and you release the bombs by pressing a button on the throttle.
There'd be a clonk clonk as they came off. You're coming down pretty fast, and you have to judge when to release the bomb and pull out without being blown up by your own bomb. 2,000 feet you start to press the tip, because by about 1,500 feet you're starting to pull out and want to be out of the way.
Diving onto a target at speeds reaching over 500 miles an hour, Typhoon pilots still face the unnerving possibility of their bombs failing to drop. With live bombs still attached, the pilots would try to shake them loose over the channel.
If you had what you call a hang-up, once you'd fused the bombs, then there was the danger when you came back that they might drop off. At least on one occasion, a chap had his bombs drop off and blew up on the airfield.
In 1943, a new weapon appeared on the scene, the rocket projectile, as it was known. They were carried initially by Swordfish and Hurricane aircraft, both of which were very slow. The Typhoon proved to be the ideal launching platform for these weapons. It was very fast and it was very stable. It could get in and make its attack and get out very quickly, and the speed that the aircraft built up during the dive, up to say 500 miles an hour, added to the speed of the rocket, of course.
The Typhoon was the first aircraft to carry and use rockets as a standard armament.
The platform of 4 20mm cannons and 8 rockets, equivalent to an 8-gun broadside from a 6-inch cruiser, they say, is a colossal firepower for one aircraft.
The first attack with rockets had been made by 181 Squadron on the 25th of October 1943, but of the 6 aircraft that went into the attack, only 3 returned.
An airplane, if it's flying perfectly, without any slip or skid, then you'll probably get a very accurate shot.
Aiming the rockets was very different from that of dive bombing, as Flight Lieutenant Ian Mallett of 174 Squadron remembers.
The old reflector gun sight had a dot in the centre, it had a circle, an orange circle, and then it had 2 lines which you could adjust for the range. But with the rocket Typhoon, they changed the gun sight, and the lower point, you've got to get the tip of that bar coming up from the bottom on the target.
Experienced pilots could deliver the rockets with astonishing precision, able to fire all the rockets either in a salvo or fire them in pairs. Having pounded the coastal radar stations in preparation for D-Day, Typhoons now turn their attention to major supply routes and ports. Softening up key targets around the proposed invasion area was now the Typhoon's main role. These missions each had their own code name. Rhubarbs, ramrods, rangers and roadsteads were just a few of the names given to different operations, taking in targets of opportunity. But in 1943, one target in particular was dreaded by Typhoon pilots, and with good reason.
I could quite honestly say that if I went to briefing, this was prior to the invasion of course, and Cherbourg came up on the screen as the target, one was not exactly shaking, but you knew that you were going to have a hell of a time.
Cherbourg's flak defences included the infamous 88mm anti-aircraft batteries, which used radar-controlled range-finding to automatically track incoming targets.
The fat wall was going up with chasers, and it just looked like driving through thick rain in a car. And it was the only time that I can remember that my feet hammered on the rudder pedals. They were shaking so much.
There were these coloured balls coming up, and they were sort of curving in towards the aircraft. And you felt, well, if they look as if they're going to hit me, I've only got to move over a little bit, and they'll go past. But before you can do anything, they go, and they're past the cockpit.
There was only one recognised technique for avoiding flak.
And weave like hell. That was the thing. You didn't fly straight and level for more than 2 ticks. Well, more than 2 ticks. Of course, they'd line up on you, and they were very accurate.
flak was the concern of every pilot, as Harry Pears recalls.
In my case, I was lucky. It only damaged the hydraulics, pipes and so on, and also grazed my right leg just below the knee, and then the piece went under my other leg, damaged the side of the aeroplane, but on the way through it took a bit of my trouser leg.
On the way in you climb to 10,000 feet from sea level, and the big stuff, the 88s, follow you in. Then as you come down in the dive, of course you get 40mm, 30mm, 20mm and 9mm fire, which is very packed sort of a thing. The big stuff, more dangerous if it was very close to you, but that was not worrying. It's when you go through all the small stuff at the bottom of the dive from about the last, say, 3,000 feet, and of course coming away from the target, that it really is dangerous. But you're wound up, the adrenaline's flowing, you've got there, you've gone down into a dive, you've clocked over 500 miles an hour, you're pulling out, you're screaming down the estuary at that speed. Who cares about flak? It's not your worry.
However, on one of his first sorties to attack shipping in the Seine estuary, John Shellard's Typhoon was badly damaged, and he would have to make a forced landing back at base.
One of the big fears was, with the huge radiator we had under the nose, and the largest propeller of any fighter in the world, 14 feet diameter, that the propeller would hit the ground before the aircraft and would cartwheel it, which would be pretty fatal. So we all decided the way to do it was to bring the airplane in and try and three-point it, but as soon as it touched, shove the stick right forward and sort of crush the airplane into the deck. And that's what I did. There was no trouble. We switched the petrol off and the ignition off, and before we actually hit the ground, and it skidded along for a couple of 100 yards. And it started to burn. That was the only trouble. We still had petrol in the tanks, and that drifted in, and the thing started to get a bit hot.
So you were out of that plane pretty quickly?
Oh yeah, I was out before it stopped.
We dived down through it and came out the clouds to see Wing Commander Pugh, oh my God, in flames and breaking up. He had got a direct hit from flak. I remember this Tom Pugh, he said to us before he was retiring the next day because he had been made up from squad leader to Wing Commander. I flew with him as his number 2, like that, and as we broke through the cloud he got a direct hit from the aircraft and it blew him up, bombs and all. I never thought he was going to die, but he was a damn good chap and a good leader.
D-Day brought with it a spectacle that few who witnessed it have forgotten to this day.
It looked to me as if the Alouette had been towed out to sea. Honestly, you had all these ships round it, and all of this big stream going towards Normandy, and it just looked as if they were filling the island with them. We were going to bomb the headquarters at Bayeux, the German headquarters, which we did successfully.
The Typhoons also knocked out the radar-controlled coastal guns, and coupled with strikes on enemy transport, they also prevented proper reinforcement of the beachheads.
One of the priorities after D-Day was to develop airstrips for which they could operate, and other RAF aircraft, and in fact the first Typhoons flew into these strips on the 13th of June, just 7 days after the invasion.
Airstrips were now being laid out by the Royal Engineers. These were constructed from mesh and perforated sheet metal, known as Sommerfeld tracking.
Within another 3 or 4 days, the Typhoon squadrons moved in to base themselves actually in France, although it was somewhat hazardous at this point due to the shelling from the Germans, who knew very well where the airfields were and were not too far away.